Hi, and welcome to the Baroque. The Baroque period, it's kind of like the Renaissance on steroids, I guess is a good way to put it, or an easy way to put it. Maybe not a good way, but an easy way to put it. The Baroque is basically 75 years, 1575 to about 1650. Of course, it lasts longer than that in some places. In particular, it lasts longer than that in the New World. So the Baroque is the first period where we actually see remnants of it on this side of the world, right? In the Americas. Most of the earliest cathedrals in the bigger cities in South and Central America and the Caribbean are actually in the Baroque style. You can see Mexico City, Bogota, Caracas, even Havana, are all in the Spanish Baroque style, which obviously comes from Spain through the colonization periods. So a lot of those are buildings you may actually be familiar with, some of you. Yeah, if you come from any of those places, you'll actually recognize the Baroque style. And like I said, it's kind of like the Renaissance on steroids. Lots of things happened during the Baroque period, of course, but probably the biggest thing happening during the Baroque period are several different wars, several big wars, actually. Even what's considered technically the First World War, even though it's not called World War I, and that's the 7 Years' War. And the reason it's called that is because it happens in Asia, in the Caribbean, in the New World, in Europe. It's happening everywhere, just like kind of World War I and World War II did later. So it's kind of pre-World War I. But most of these battles and most of these arguments and most of these wars are about one thing, more than one thing. One main thing, which is the breakup of the Catholic Church and the power vacuum that it leaves behind. Somebody wants to take that spot. So you have the powers that back the Catholic Church, like France and Spain, for example. And then the powers that have completely separated the Catholic from the Catholic Church, Prussia, which would later be Germany, England, of course, and Switzerland, although generally Switzerland, even back then, kind of stayed out of the wars and the fights. And kind of been eternally neutral. So Europe kind of starts to look like you're used to seeing it. Spain, France, Holland, which is still Holland, but called the Netherlands, Flanders, which is now called Belgium, England, Spain, Portugal, and again, Prussia, which is later to become Germany, but Denmark, Norway, Sweden are already out. Italy is probably the only major country that still isn't really a country yet. It's pretty much controlled by others, still part of the Holy Roman Empire in the north, and part of the Kingdom of Spain in the south, which I think a lot of you don't realize Spain was in charge of Italy for quite some time. A lot of Spanish influence in the southern part of Italy in particular. So, like I said, the characteristics of the Baroque are going to be hard to distinguish from the Renaissance, except way more religious stuff in the Baroque, way more decorations in the Baroque, and I'll show you that as we go through them. But for the most part, like the outside of a building, for the most part, it would be really hard to tell if it's a Renaissance building or a Baroque building. So one of the things the Baroque does is this new technique called trompe l'oeil, which just means trick your eye, trick of the eye in French. And that is they paintings give illusions. So for example, in this particular painting, the frames around the painting in the center and then at the two ends on the left and right actually aren't frames. That's part of the paint. So this isn't a big trick, don't get me wrong, but it is the beginning of the tricks. They get much better, as we'll see as we get later on. So just like the Renaissance, there's some big stars in the Baroque. One of those big stars in painting is a guy called Michelangelo Caravaggio, in this case, not the Ninja Turtle version, but the Baroque version, who basically takes Leonardo's chiaroscuro technique, the light and the dark, and again, puts it on steroids, makes parts of the painting actually black, as you can see here, and then parts of the painting actually white, again, as you can see here, using that kind of extreme, playing off of one another to make it the light source almost, and almost all of his paintings seem almost religious. In this particular case, it's supposed to be religious. So this is the calling of St. Matthew. Jesus is on the right, pointing at St. Matthew, who's pointing at himself, and on the left in the center. Me, right? But if you look at above Jesus's head, where his halo kind of mixes into the light from the window or doorway or some kind of portal that's coming in from over there is, if you follow the line, is pointing at St. Matthew, right? And the guy next to him, who both will become followers of Jesus. So the light is kind of like the divine light of God hitting Matthew to come follow Jesus, who would later write, of course, one of the Gospels. And the same kind of thing happening here. In this case, though, however, it's St. Paul, who has been knocked off his horse and blinded by, Jesus comes to him in a vision, knocks him off the horse, blinds him, and why are you persecuting my people? Why are you persecuting me? Because Paul persecutes Christians. Almost Saul persecutes Christians. He later changes his name to Paul. So this is when he converts, that moment when he sees Jesus and talks to Jesus. And then goes to the city of Damascus, where he meets a bishop who, cures him of his blindness. Miracle happens. He's now a Christian. He's no longer a Christian hunter. And again, he becomes ridiculously important to Christianity, you could say, and you should say, is the inventor of Christianity. Prior to him, Peter, Mark, Matthew, Luke, not Luke, Mark, Matthew, Peter, and the other 12 apostles, fight with Paul. If you read the Acts of the Apostles, they fight over who's allowed to be a Christian and who's not. It's Paul who basically changes all the rules and says, all you need to do is believe in Jesus to become a Christian. You don't have to follow all these other rules, right? So he makes Christianity the way it is today, right? It's Paul, not any of the other real apostles, actually. Again, bright, magical kind of source of light coming in. What Caravaggio is most famous for, however, is what you see in this painting, which is he used real people to model for his pictures. So the Jesus in this picture is actually a local homeless guy, and the Mary in this picture is actually a local prostitute, which, of course, got him in a little bit of trouble. How dare you make a prostitute Mary and a homeless guy Jesus? But he wanted to use real people and real models. He even puts himself in here, the one looking at you in the painting. The one that's holding Jesus' legs is actually a self-portrait. However, he doesn't really get rich. He gets famous, don't get me wrong. He's painting everywhere in Europe. But he doesn't get rich because he's not very good with his money. He's a spendthrift. The first kind of successful artist that makes money while they're alive and is successful while they're alive and, makes a living off of it is actually one of his students, Artemisia Gentileschi, who also, by coincidence, is the first female named artist that we know of, right? It wasn't that women probably weren't painting before this. I'm sure they were, but that she could sign her paintings, that she was recognized as a painter. And as such, she's the first. Most of her paintings involve pictures of women hurting men, which is related to kind of her personal life. The story's in there for you guys to read. Obviously famous historical slayings and hurtings of people. So Judith slaying Holofernes, I think, Esther, the famous Purim set festival. So again, imagination here, you got to imagine the dome. You don't see just the front of the building. The front of the building is the only thing that's Baroque. The dome is still Renaissance. It was actually designed by Michelangelo. The front, however, originally designed by a Renaissance artist, was redone or changed in the middle of the plan since it wasn't finished, and finished in the Baroque style. So like I said, Baroque and Renaissance, impossible to tell. If I divided this building in half, it's the same on both sides. That's what we said, is symmetrical of the Renaissance. How we know this is, what's the hint that it's Baroque? In this case, it's not much, other than there's extreme decoration, right? So there's a balcony on every window on the second floor. There's too many statues, like overkill with the statues at the top. But more importantly, it's the doubling up of the columns. So if you look at the top floor, instead of one column at each window, it's two columns at each window. That's one of the giveaways that it's Baroque instead of Renaissance. Usually it's the inside is better to tell. Same thing you notice here in the middle portal, both next to the door and above, next to that little apse. The pillars are doubled, right? So, that's how we know it's Baroque instead of Renaissance. But it's not much, right? Where you see the big differences are in interiors of the buildings. And again, we'll see some of the interiors of the buildings later. The second big star of the Baroque period is a sculptor called Gian Lorenzo Bernini, whose father was also a sculptor, although less popular and less famous than his son. Bernini is the guy who basically creates a whole new genre of sculpture, sculpture in motion. Kind of like if you took a picture and then sculpted the picture, right? Somebody in the middle of doing something. So here's Pluto, or Hades, for those who know the story, with Persephone, or Proserpina, for those who are more familiar with the story, in the act of capturing her, and he's going to bring her to the underworld to live with him, right? Against her will, obviously. And so here you have him grabbing her with really amazing, again, really remember, I think the hard thing to remember when we look at sculpture sometimes is that it's not clay, right? It's not a bendable, moldable material. This is stone. Stone is not pliable. But if you look at the top picture here, you can see his hand digging into her thigh, right? And it looks like it's pushing into her flesh, right? And that's what Bernini is amazing at. He does it over and over and over again. His cloth is amazing. It looks like cloth. It looks real. When he makes a pillow, it looks like a pillow, right? So again, usually in motion, his David is in the motion of throwing the slingshot rather than thinking about it or celebrating it like Donatello and Michelangelo did, right? He's actually throwing the slingshot. He's in that S-shaped body of twisting and turning, right? Another one of his great works of art is the Apollo and Daphne, a very similar story to Pluto and Persephone, in that Apollo falls in love with the daughter of one of the tree gods. She doesn't want any part of him. She's trying to escape. He's going to rape her. So the father sees it happening and turns her into a tree. And you kind of see that happening. If you look at the bottom picture, her legs are turning into tree bark. And if you look at the top picture, her hands are turning into branches and leaves. Again, remembering this is stone, not clay. Bernini also did a few architectural things, not a lot, but a few, most of which he did for the church. In this case, again, imagination, pretend you don't see the church at all here, and just look at the columns out front, the colonnade out front, the kind of thing that looks like it's stretching out with big arms, kind of giving you a big hug. He designed that whole area, the columns, the piazza, the central column in the middle standing out. All of that is designed by Bernini. He also designed the altar inside of St. Peter's, which is called the altar cover, which is called a baldacchino. So hard to tell you until you go there just how big everything is inside St. Peter's. It's the biggest church in the world, so therefore everything in there is big. For example, the letters you see at the top there, the NDO, REFV, each letter is 6 feet tall, to give you an idea how big. This altar cover is 93 feet tall, right? The statue in the back holding the cross is about 20 feet tall, right? And then behind it, he also built a memorial to St. Peter, the first pope, who his original chair was still in the church. There's the chair. Now, obviously, the chair didn't look like that you see in this photo. The chair is actually underneath. He covered it in bronze and then carved the bronze to make the chair look even more beautiful. It's just a plain wooden chair underneath. Above, if you look at the top, there's a little window. You probably can't see it in this picture, but you have to trust me on this one. Inside the little window is a dove representing the Holy Spirit, who's obviously descending on whoever the Pope is, right? But here's Baroque at its perfect explanation of what the heck Baroque is. If you look at this, the 4 people holding the chair, the dove coming down from the window, and then the extravagant gold and rays of light shooting out. This is Baroque overkill. Like I said, that overkill, that way too many angels. If you look at the top, there's way too many angels going on here, right? There's just too much. It's overkill. One of his more controversial works is St. Teresa in Ecstasy. And it is St. Teresa who, for those of you who don't know, is the saint, the woman, if he was a nun, who convinced the popes to leave France and go back to Rome, right? To get out, stop hiding out in France, go back to Rome, where you're supposed to be. And she's also the one who had several visions. She's one of the few female doctors of the Catholic Church. Now, not doctor, medical doctor. A doctor of the church is a doctor of the faith, which means what they say or what visions they had or what communications they had with the divine are considered to be true, right? 100% true. And their teachings are the teachings of the church equal. But St. Teresa is the one who dreamed or had a vision of what happened to Jesus the day they crucified him. So all the kind of details you know about Jesus' crucifixion, him getting beat, him getting whipped, him having the crown of thorns put on his head, stabbed in his side, and all those kind of things actually come from St. Teresa's vision. So if you saw the movie The Passion of the Christ, it's not based on the biblical version of what happened. It's based on the St. Teresa's version of what happened. So one of her visions is the angel Gabriel came to her and took an arrow filled with God's love and pierced her heart with it. So Bernini is doing that moment when the angel comes and pierces her. So again, this kind of was a little bit controversial because he's an angel. Why is he lifting up her blouse? Look at her face. She looks like she's having an orgasm, right? She's having way too much pleasure in this. But it, didn't get him in a lot of trouble, but it got a little trouble, a little bit of controversy. His other famous things that he did a ton of fountains for the city of Rome. There's a ton. The most famous is the Fountain of the Four Rivers you see here. He also did some of the other fountains in the Piazza Navona. And then the church in the Piazza Navona is actually by another guy, Borromini, who's his kind of enemy. He also built this bridge that goes to the Castle Sant'Angelo, which is the Pope's kind of, private getaway when he doesn't want to be in the church or in the Vatican apartments. It originally was a mausoleum of the Emperor Hadrian, but they turned it into kind of like a fortress for the Pope in case anything happened. This was a good place to hide. It used to have all kinds of cannons. And so he built the bridge to that place, to that refuge, and the angels on top of the bridge. And the angels are, considered some of the greatest amazing angels ever. So his kind of rival that they didn't like each other and kind of fought all the time was a guy who was an architect, so it doesn't make sense they weren't competing over the same jobs, called Borromini, maybe because he was getting equally famous at the same time. And Borromini gets famous because of what you kind of see here in this picture, which is you just saw a bunch of churches throughout the Renaissance, and now you just saw two. You saw Santa Susana, and you saw the Vatican itself, St. Peter's, and you probably noticed they're square flat. Right. So what Borromini does that no other architect had done before, for 1,000 years or so, is get rid of straight lines. The front of this church is curved, you'll notice. The top of this church, the dome, isn't even a straight circle, right? It's not a straight dome. Kind of goes out, comes in, goes out, comes in. You can see it best inside here, where it kind of goes out, comes in, goes out, comes in, right? And he's the one who built the church in that same square in that Piazza Navona that I was just talking about. Again, it's still in the same traditional side. This is kind of one of his earlier ones, but you can kind of see the curves next to the two towers. The church curves in instead of a flat facade, right? Back to one of those trick the eye ones. So this is one of those trick the eye ones, which you're probably going, this isn't tricking me. I can tell this is a flat ceiling. And you're right, you can tell this is a flat ceiling. But the idea is that it gives you the illusion that it's not. But if you look at the windows, on the top, the 3 windows, and the bottom, the 3 windows, and if you're looking at them without me telling you to look at them, you thought they were windows until I just told you they're not. That's part of the painting. So that's the little trick there to make you think there are actually windows there that there weren't. This is another one of those tricks. That ceiling from this angle looks like it goes up, right? And into a curved shape. However, that's the ceiling. It is completely flat, right? Let me see what else. The next big guy I want to stop at, again, doesn't mean you don't have to stop. That it won't be on the quiz or the test. But the next big guy is Velázquez. He's the next big superstar. He's the first kind of non-Italian superstar. And he is Spanish. He did train in Italy, but then moved back to Spain where he became lucky, if you want, and became the court painter for the King and Queen of Spain. So all of the paintings for the King and Queen of Spain was his. He could do, every single painting they wanted. He was going to do it for them. He worked for them, which meant he was all set for the rest of his life. And that becomes a big thing in the 1600s, is kings and queens of different countries and nobles, dukes and duchesses, etc., all find their special painter to paint for them. The King and Queen of France do Rubens. The King of England does Van Dyck, right? The King of Spain has Velázquez, like I told you. And they all kind of get these sweet jobs, which means they're all set basically for the rest of their life. They're always going to get paid. Even when they're not painting, they're getting paid. They're making a salary, if you can imagine, like a salary way back then. What he's kind of famous for, although Rembrandt is probably more famous than he now, is taking oil, adding it to paint. And then you can see in this picture in particular how adding oil to paint gives it a shine. It looks like the Pope's vest or whatever he's wearing there is shining and shimmery, almost like satin, right? You can kind of see that it looks satin. And it also gives you depth. If you look at the Pope's face here, it looks pretty realistic, right? It almost looks like a photograph. The funny part is this is not one of his famous works. His most famous work is this one, Las Meninas, which is translates to Maid of Honor. So the two girls on the right, no. Let's start on the left. Let's ignore the tall guy standing up. But the tall guy standing up on the far left is actually Velázquez. That's him. He painted himself in the painting. And what's he doing? He's painting the painting in the painting, which is pretty funny, right? Then next to him is the three daughters of the king. The one in the middle is the one who's getting married. Yep, that's right. That little 6-year-old girl is the one who's getting married. Her two sisters are helping her get ready. Behind them is a priest and a nun. And then if we go all the way over to the right is the court dwarf. I don't know why she would have ended up in this painting. And the king's little boy, the little son, who's about 4 or 5 years old, who's kicking the dog for some reason. If you look in the background of the painting, behind the nun in the doorway is the French ambassador. He's watching them prepare, because who is this little girl marrying? She's marrying the King of France's son. Right? That's who she's marrying. And then if you look to the left of the ambassador in the doorway and to the right of the painter, there's a painting in the wall that looks like a painting. It's not, it's a mirror. That's the King and Queen of Spain who are watching it from this side. So we're like in the eyes of the King and Queen of Spain watching their daughter get ready to get married. So to the 9-year-old son of the King of France. Like I told you before, 2 seconds ago, Rubens becomes lucky. He becomes the court painter of France eventually. He also trained in Italy before moving back to Belgium and the Netherlands, and then even in Germany he did a lot of work. But eventually ends up working for the King and Queen of Spain. Although, again, a lot of his work is outside of there. He's famous for his ridiculously overly muscular men, similar to Michelangelo, and his chunky women. As a matter of fact, his chunky women are so famous, here you go, that the word in English for a chunky woman, no one uses it anymore, but it's more proper and it's not insulting, is Rubenesque. When you say somebody's Rubenesque, you mean they're chunky, but very attractive. Right? Most of the naked, chunky women in his paintings, including the one we just went by, are his wife and her sisters. So somehow he was just getting lucky to always get his wife and her sisters to pose naked for him. Like I said, he eventually paints for the King and Queen of Spain. France. And this is one of the series of paintings he does for them. And that's the whole life cycle of Marie de Medici, who is obviously from Florence, of the Medici family, but she marries the King of France. Let me see. Like I told you earlier, the court painter for the King of England becomes Anthony Van Dyck, who paints the King of England doing different things. Here he is, I guess, right after a hunt or getting ready to go on a hunt. And then, of course, everybody, again, another big superstars of the Baroque is a guy named Rembrandt van Rijn, who we generally just call Rembrandt. Actually, one of the few, him and Leonardo, the few painters we just call by their first name. Michelangelo, when he says 3. He's just an interesting story in that he never made money. I know this is kind of hard to believe, because if you owned this painting right here, for example, this one that's standing in front of us, this is probably worth $100 million today. But he probably got $60 for it back then. He never really got famous while he was alive, which is interesting. But even this painting of a dead cow is going to get you $30 million. His talent wasn't recognized till after he was dead. As a matter of fact, he died so poor that he didn't even get a tombstone. Right? Did a lot of religious paintings. What he's probably most famous for are his self-portraits, and maybe that's why he didn't make a lot of money, right? So, like you said, he painted himself pretty frequently. And again, who wants? I mean, if you think about it, I mean, now you'd want, because you know how much they're worth. But who wants a picture of you? Like if I went to an art studio to buy a painting, I wouldn't buy a painting of the painter. I would think that was weird. I mean, maybe now you wouldn't think it was weird because now you know, hey, maybe later when he dies, his stuff will be worth a lot of money. But that's, not what people were thinking then. You can kind of see here, he kind of gets loose with the paintbrush, so it's kind of precursor to Impressionism later. His most famous painting, by far, his masterpiece, if you want, which is improperly titled. It is not really called The Night Watch, but that's what we know it as. But somebody threw acid or something, or smashed it with a hammer. I forget what it was. And when they cleaned the painting, when they fixed the painting, repaired the painting, they realized, oh, it's not this dark. It's one of those interesting things of how art critics are full of crap. This is considered one of the greatest paintings of all time for a long time, because look at all the black, how black it is in the top right? And how that girl, Angel, just shines so much brighter than everyone else. And the two guys in the front shine brighter than everyone else. This is an amazing scene captured at night, blah, 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 blah. When they cleaned it, here you go. You'll notice it's not at night at all. It's in the daytime. Nobody is super duper extra shiny. All of that black was just candle soot because it was in a museum with candles in front of it. So all the dust and ash from the candle covered the paintings, and the parts that were shiny were where the candles were standing. So you also get to see that there's a really good picture to see like how this life size, the size of paintings, like in slideshows, you can't tell. Some of them are much bigger than you could imagine, and then some are so small it's disappointing. Another guy that kind of precursor to Impressionism is Frans Hals, who again kind of blurry on purpose. That's not a blurry picture, that's a blurry painting, because that's how he painted it, for two reasons. One, I guess he was changing his style, but two, this guy is supposed to be drunk, so blurry, drunk, right? Get it? Makes sense. Vermeer is another guy you guys all know, probably not because of any of these paintings, but because of this one. His most famous painting for sure is The Girl with the Pearl Earring, which they even made a movie about, which is not based on the truth in any way, shape, or form, but doesn't matter, right? This is often called the Mona Lisa of the North because of the mystery behind it. We don't know who she is. We don't even know if she's real. So there's a lot of mystery behind this painting. Quickly, I guess, maybe not quickly, but something that's interesting to note is that the French paintings and the French Baroque painters pretty much never got out of the Renaissance. So you're still seeing, you're probably going, this looks like a Renaissance painting. And that's because you're right. Because the French never really, in architecture, they went all out in the Baroque, probably the kings of the Baroque in architecture. But in painting, they basically stayed and stuck to the Renaissance, the colors, the style, the themes, even the Romans and the Greeks and that kind of stuff. But what they're probably excel probably better than anyone else in is definitely in their architecture. So you can kind of see here, the most famous of the Baroque architecture things is the Palace of Versailles, which if you notice in the picture, if you look in the top left a little bit towards the center, is this building sticking up above the rest of the building. That's actually a church. And yes, the king figured, why should I go to church? The church should come to me. So there you go. The church was built in the middle of his palace so that the priests could come and do church for him. And he didn't have to go all the way out to Paris. This is about 15 minutes outside of Paris by car. Train is about 15 minutes, obviously by horse. Back then, it probably would have been an hour, 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half. There's a bunch of different beautiful entranceways to the palace. There's not just one. This is the royal one where the king and queen would come in. The most famous room in the Palace of Versailles, of course, is the Hall of Mirrors, and this is where we get to see Baroque at Baroque's best. As in terms of an example, you may not think it's pretty, but you may think it's tacky, and you should, because Baroque is trying to be tacky. Overuse of gold, too many statues, too many everything, right? I think it's worse in the war room, and here's the war room. Look at all of the gold decoration, all of, it's totally overkill. The chandelier, if you notice, if you look in the picture closely, you'll see the Hall of Mirrors is actually next to it. It's attached to this room. But this room would have been the room where the king was planning war. Like, if they're at war, this is where you would show, talk about where to send your troops, etc. Even the bedrooms, like ridiculously extravagant, like ridiculously overkill decoration. The chapel, that church that I just told you, here's the church. You can even see inside the church, even overkill. Of course, the king also didn't want to have to go see a play in Paris or go to the opera in Paris. So inside the palace, they built him a little opera house so he could go and obviously invite his friends. Versailles is also famous for its gardens, probably the most famous gardens in the world. And they're bigger than you see in this picture. This picture isn't even going to do you any kind of justice of how big it is. The gardens are probably the size of Hialeah, if that helps figure how long it's going to take you to go visit all these places. I'm going to get through these real quick, the different fountains and the different gardens. This particular one you see here is pretty much the spot to get married if you're French. Lots of weddings are done there. And then the king's wife was from the countryside. And so she used to complain a lot about, I hate living in the city. So he built on those garden grounds a little mini medieval town that looked like her original village in a smaller version to make her happy, which is pretty funny. So here you can kind of see in the Baroque outside of a church where you got the overkill, right? The double columns, like I told you, but if you look at the top of the church, you can kind of see the overkill on the dome, right? The extra gold color, like on purpose. This particular church is most famous because Napoleon's tomb is inside of it. The tomb is way bigger than Napoleon ever was. And the Baroque pretty much makes it everywhere. Although the English Baroque, which I just flew through, is pretty much similar in architecture, similar to the French idea in painting. It stayed pretty much, Renaissance. It's very, very difficult to tell unless you're an expert, so don't worry about it. But since Versailles became so popular and so well known throughout the rest of Europe, other of the European kings and leaders, the archdukes, etc., and so on, wanted to have a palace as cool as Versailles. So in Vienna, you have the Schönbrunn Palace for the Habsburg family, right? The archdukes, very similar in terms of extravagant overkill. You can kind of see in these pictures, right? This building that you think is a building here, right, is actually like one room on the outside of the gardens, so that if it got too hot, you could go in that room and relax, right? In that palace, right? And then the King of Savoy has his own place. And then you have the other one, the Tsar in Russia, which we'll see shortly. So again, you can kind of see even the churches start to get overkill. These two gigantic copies of the columns of Trajan. I have no idea why you would do that and put them in Austria. It makes no sense whatsoever, but why not? The decorations of the monasteries even are getting insanely extravagant on the outside, and then even more so on the inside. If you look at the picture on the left and the library picture on the top right, it's insane amount of decoration, right? The only thing that gets worse than the Baroque, honestly, is the Rococo. And we'll see that shortly. Probably one of the most famous works of Baroque art that actually wasn't even done in the Baroque period, but it was done in the Baroque style, is the Trevi Fountain, the famous fountain you throw your coins in if you want to go back to Rome or if you want to meet your true love. There's 3 coins you throw. One is for love, one is to come back to Rome, and I forget what the third one is for. I used to know. Maybe to come back to Rome with the one you love. I think that's what it is. There's a close-up of it. Currently, they just reopened it. It wasn't closed. Reopened it where you can sit where the people are sitting in this picture. It used to be fenced off because of COVID, so that people wouldn't get too close to each other. And then not far from the Trevi Fountain is actually the Spanish Steps, another work of Baroque art. The steps, not the church, not the buildings. The funny thing is that little fountain in front of the steps is actually built by Bernini's father. And then a big change in Spanish Baroque is by a family led by the father, Jose Churriguera, that starts their own style of Baroque art called Churrigueris. I can never say it right. Churrigueris. And this is something that may look familiar to a lot of you, because that is the style of most of the churches in Central and South America, especially in Mexico, but also in Colombia and Venezuela, in Uruguay. This guy's family basically, he had probably 20 kids or whatever it was, and they all took his style, and a lot of it went to the New World, like I said. If this kind of looks familiar to you, that's probably why, even though this is in Spain. And I told you the Palace of the Tsars as well in Russia also had to have a big fancy palace with big fancy gardens, right? And then, of course, what really is different in the Baroque is the invention kind of modern music and improvisation. So we don't kind of think of jazz as a 1600s thing, and because it isn't, right? But the idea of jazz and the idea of improvising and the idea of making it up as you go along comes from the Baroque period, in particular Bach, who's there at the top. You can click on it if you want, and listen to some of Bach. Bach is probably the only, well, actually, I was going to say that, but that's not true. You know several songs by Bach, even though you don't know Bach. You definitely know the Hallelujah chorus here. And you might know the Four Seasons. But Bach for sure you know, because if you've ever been to Disney and if you've ever been on the Haunted Mansion ride, it plays a Bach song. They use a lot of Bach for, funny, he's a very religious guy, but they use a lot of Bach for horror movies, which is funny or ironic, I guess, because poor Bach, all of his songs are kind of praising Jesus, but they're often used in horror movies because they're kind of creepy sounding, the way the organ sounds. Okay, and so that wraps this one up.